Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Cindy, and thank you everyone for joining this talk. So really delighted to be here to present the patient voice in focused, advancing early phase oncology trials through pro-driven innovations. So one of the things that I want to highlight is it's very much going to be and really a journey of pros and integration of pros in early phase trials. So it's going to be more conceptual rather than technical, but very happy to answer further questions if you've got any technical aspects of it that you're interested in. So I'm going to start off by asking you, how do we decide that a dose is tolerable? And what evidence do we actually use? I'm going to give you 10 seconds to think about it, like really thinking about how, when you're designing a trial, how do we decide, or when you're analyzing your trial results, how do you decide that a dose is actually tolerable? And what evidence do we actually use to be able to tell whether a dose is tolerable? Okay, so I think that, oh, sorry, I think there could be some answers here. So there could be, you might have thought about dose-limiting toxicities, clinician-reported adverse events, treatment adherence in terms of modifications, interruption, discontinuations due to non-tolerability, or hopefully you've also thought about patient-reported tolerability experience since we're here today. Okay, so the outline of my talk is, first of all, I'm going to touch on just really a brief introduction on what are PROs, patient-reported outcomes, where do they fit in the clinical development across the different phases, why dose-finding oncology trials need better tolerability evidence, and then I'll touch on what's the current PRO landscape in dose-finding oncology trials, and I'll move on to the OPTIMISE guidance from objectives to analysis, and I'll introduce some of the formal pro-integrated trial designs. So those are pros that are integrated within dose escalation or dose optimization designs. And I'll end off with some key takeaways. So what are patient-reported outcomes? So as defined by the US Department of Health, it is any report of the status of a patient's health condition that comes directly from the patient without interpretation of the patient's response by a clinician or anyone else. So PROs can help us to capture how a treatment affects patients, for example, in terms of symptoms, whether like pain, fatigue, nauseous, or in terms of functioning, so physical functioning, emotional functioning, or social functioning, or health-related quality of life. What is treatment tolerability? So as defined by the Friends of Cancer Research, the tolerability of a medicinal product is the degree to which symptomatic and non-symptomatic adverse events associated with the product's administration affect the ability or the desire of the patient to adhere to the dose or intensity of the therapy. Now let us look at role of PROs across the clinical development pathway. So as we know very well, as it goes through from phase 1 to phase 3, so phase 1 is about dose finding, then moving on to phase 2 about preliminary efficacy, and then phase 3 is about confirmatory efficacy. So the decision focus in phase 1 is to really see whether a dose is safe, whether treatment is safe, and was it tolerable, and then decide on what's the recommended dose to bring forward to the next phase. And then for the phase 2, it's about signal confirmation, and for phase 3, it's about benefit risk. So looking at pros for the tolerability aspects of it, it can tell us about symptomatic, in terms of to assess tolerability, the aspects of pros that we could actually look at is the symptomatic adverse events. So similar to what clinicians report using CT-CAE, the side effect burden for the patients, as well as health-related quality of life. So pros could be utilized for and tolerability as well as treatment benefit, but in terms of dose finding, the focus here is more on tolerability. And obviously that can then inform what is the best recommended phase 2 dose or recommended dose range. Now, as you move on to phase 2, pros actually can take on two roles. They can actually assess tolerability, similar kind of pro concepts that we have just mentioned, or it could be actually also looking at pros for treatment benefits. So you want to look at whether there's improvement in health-related quality of life, whether there's symptom improvement or function improvement. We're increasingly seeing a lot more seamless phase 1-2. So actually pros could be looking at both tolerability and treatment benefit for phase 1-2 trials. Now in the phase 3 setting, it's similar to the phase 2, whereby actually pros can be utilized for both tolerability as well as treatment benefit. And it supports that benefit risk assessment as well as labeling. So PROs can be used to assess tolerability throughout clinical development, but PROs to assess treatment benefit typically begin from phase 2. So why dose-finding oncology trials need better tolerability assessment? So toxicity profiles in dose-finding oncology trials are often incompletely characterized. Clinician-reported adverse events under-capture symptoms. You can see from the diagram on the right, whereby it's really clear on the left, on the blue bars are the patient-reported symptomatic adverse events, and that's matched with the clinician-reported symptomatic adverse events on the left, on the orange bars. So it's really clear that there's a lot more reporting from the patients for the same symptoms compared to from clinicians. So there's really a great underreporting, as shown in this paper. So this was captured in dose-finding trials in phase 1 in one single site at Princess Margaret Cancer Center. So this obviously impact on tolerability assessment if PROs are not included, and it can affect recommended phase 2 dose selection as well as downstream development decisions. What is considered clinically safe may not necessarily be what is acceptable to the patients. So if we selected a non-tolerable dose to bring forward to the next phase, that can increase the risk of treatment discontinuation and modifications for the patients. And then actually that would lead us to having inaccurate evaluation of the efficacy and exposes patients to unnecessary harm. So that obviously leads to costly delays and failures and really trying to then optimize the dose, or perhaps even actually not seeing the advantage of a particular treatment because of treatments, because of too much of the treatment discontinuation. Now let's move on to the fact of what are the components that actually help us to better understand treatment tolerability. So this is a really good figure that's brought together by the NCI Cancer Treatment Tolerability Consortium. It sums up what the different kind of key components that help us to better understand tolerability. So there's a safety data component. So we know that it's about the clinician-reported adverse events. That includes non-symptomatic as well as symptomatic, hospitalizations and death. There's also this central part, is it the patient experience data? So that's where patient-reported comes in. So you have the patient-reported symptomatic adverse events, overall side effect burden, health-related quality of life, functioning, as well as wearable device and sensor data. And lastly is about treatment data, about the treatment adherence that we talked about earlier on, about interruptions, discontinuation. And obviously the additional factors such as comorbidities that also impact on tolerability. So you can see from here that patient-reported outcomes are essential to help us to better understand tolerability. And so I guess the question is then, can we say a treatment is well tolerated without patient-reported outcomes? So this is a quote from the FDA in the Project OPTIMISE guidance here. So PROs can provide a systematic and quantitative assessment of expected symptomatic side effects and their impact on functions. Inclusion of PROs should be considered to enhance assessment of tolerability in dose-finding trials as well as subsequent trials. Now you might wonder what's the added values of PROs. So they offer the direct insight into patient-reported tolerability, complementing clinician-reported data. And the aspects that they could really help is to identify tolerability signals early. So they can identify early and persistent symptoms, enabling proactive management and supportive measures. For example, whether you need to monitor the patients more regularly, and whether there could be some supportive measures to help the patients to stay on treatment a bit longer. It informs better dose selections, so identifying optimal dosage through an enhanced understanding of tolerability. It can also help us to differentiate treatments. It can help differentiate between two different treatments based on differences in patient-reported tolerability, particularly if the other endpoints are very similar features. So dose finding and used to be very much about dose escalation to find the maximum tolerated dose, but we know that actually for the novel agents, for example, immunotherapy and targeted therapies, the higher doses may not be more active. So dose finding is actually much more about dose optimization now. So this figure is from the paper from the Annals of Oncology that shows just an illustration of how such dose optimization or dose finding design could look like now. So you have the initial part of the dose escalation. So here we see 7 dose levels. You escalate to the next dose level if there's no DLTs or dose-limiting toxicities. And once you get to the dose, once you have explored that dose range, you then identify the doses that you're interested in to go into dose optimization phase. You could randomize patients to several of those doses, in this case, about 3 dose levels, You still monitor the dose-limiting toxicity, but at the end of that, you actually want to use the totality of data, so all the information that is useful to help you select the best dose. So I mentioned about the totality of evidence, and here really the different aspects that helps us to actually better define what's the best dose. So we've often looked at safety, including DLTs as a primary endpoint. Increasingly, we're looking at preliminary efficacy in terms of treatment response to help us to support decisions, as well as PK and PD. And the one aspect that's very important is also tolerability, because it's typically the primary objective of those oncology trials here. And we looked at dose modifications, interruption, discontinuation, and that's why PROs could also be very helpful to help us to better assess tolerability. What is the current PRO landscape in dose-finding oncology trials? Now, we have seen that PRO use has been increasing, but it's still quite low. So in the review that we did using clinicaltrials.gov, we've seen it increasing from 3.2% in 2007 to 6.4% 2020. In a very recent review, and it found 12% after the kind of the Project OPTIMISE has been in place of the increased in PROs. So we expect that trend to continue. The stakeholder support is, however, high. So this is actually being done, the survey was being done even before Project OPTIMISE came in. So the agreement for using PROs to inform those recommended phase 2 dose, and we asked professionals, over 100 participants, 68% of them agree and strongly agree that PROs should be utilized for informing recommended phase 2 dose. And we asked patients, patient group, about 50 of them, 95% of them strongly agree to that. However, the top 3 barriers that has been identified as the key reasons why people haven't been really integrating PROs, even though there is the support that is high. First of all, the lack of guidance of how to best integrate PROs, missing data, as well as overburdening staff. Now let's look at how have PROs been used. So in the PubMed review done by Emily in PhD, she looked at 35 dose-finding oncology trials with PRO analysis in 2016 to 2022. We found that most PRO objectives were descriptive. Only 4 trials, about 11% of them, used PROs to inform dose decisions, 3 in the final analysis to confirm the recommended phase 2 dose, and 1 for both the interim and the final dose selection. There are, however, clear quality gaps. 86% of those trial papers lack clear PRO objectives. So it means that it's not very clear why they're incorporating PROs and what they're trying to do with the PROs. There's also substantial heterogeneity exists in how they have analyzed the PROs. And most did not report PRO data by dose level, even they collected it within a dose finding setting. So this represents a missed opportunity in early phase learning. Let's look at a case study. So I'm going to look through 2 case studies, so examples of how PROs have been used. So this is the first case study, was actually quite an old study, 2016. We're looking at determining maximum tolerated dose of either rubicin after a single taste session. So the MTD was defined as a dose level that's closest to DLT level of 20%. So this is using a continual reassessment method, so a model-based approach. The secondary objective was to assess health-related quality of life and recommended phase 2 dose association to time to deterioration approach. So they collected a PRO instrument called ERT-CTLQ-C30. It's a very common PRO instrument of 30 questions, and they measured at baseline, day 15, 30, 60, and post-taste. So the trial results have got 21 patients being recruited. They saw one dose limiting toxicity per dose level, so 5, 10, 15. And then the MTD was recommended utilizing the CRM as 10 milligrams. They then did this study whereby they analyzed the PROs and found that PROs actually supported also the maximum tolerated dose of 10 milligrams as the preferred dose. So this was done, so on the right, you can see the Kaplan-Meier curves for the time to deterioration with a 5-point minimum clinically important difference across different PRO domains. So they've looked at, for example, physical functioning, fatigue, and pain, as well as the global health status. So they saw longer time to deterioration at 5 milligrams versus 10 milligrams versus 5 milligrams, so 10 milligrams in green, yellow in 5 milligrams. You can see that's much higher than the 5 milligram overall. And obviously, you could also see that actually because of the small numbers here, the confidence interval is quite wide, so it's not very precise. So although 5 milligrams and 10 milligrams were acceptable as safe, patients at 10 milligrams appear to experience slower symptom deterioration, maintain quality of life, and function longer, and that helped them to kind of prefer that 10 milligrams as a dose to bring forward. So as the authors quoted, this study suggests the added value of patient-reported symptoms and health-related quality of life patients as a complement to the usual toxicity assessment and DLT definition. Now let's look at a second case study. So this was published more recently, looking at in cell renal cell carcinoma. So they've got a fixed dose of nivolumab for sirtuximab doses at 60, 80 milligrams, 120, and 150, with 80 as the starting dose. They look at the co-primary endpoints of time to DLT within 12 weeks of starting therapies, and the early efficacy endpoint was defined as the absence of progressive disease at 6 weeks. So they looked at a series of secondary endpoints, and where quality of life is one of them. So the design that they've implemented was a phase 1/2 late onset efficacy toxicity design, and they're looking for the best F-tox desirable score based on both toxicity and efficacy as the early efficacy endpoints. So this study was actually really well reported, and you can see for this figure here, they reported what happened to each patient. So there could be no early efficacy of DLTs, no early efficacy, but DLT occurred. Both early efficacy and DLT occurred in yellow, and for blue is where early efficacy occurred but no DLT. Now the table below shows the models and also the results as well. So you can see that at 80 milligrams, they have 80% of the patients who experience early efficacy compared to 87.5% at 120 milligrams. And for number of DLTs was 27% versus 42%. Now, if you look at the estimated F-tox trade-off, it was 0.787 at 80 milligrams and 0.7755 at 120 milligrams. So obviously, if you look at efficacy, estimated efficacy F-tox trade-off, actually 80 milligrams is actually slightly higher. But looking at the secondary endpoints, so pink is for 80 milligrams and 120 milligrams is in green here. So the overall response rate was higher for 120 milligrams. And when you look at whether the Bayesian postural probability is higher ORR as well as longer progression-free survival with 120 milligrams compared to 80 milligrams, it was much higher to 81 and 68%. And they also look at the quality of life measures such as lower depression, higher quality of life, and highest hope for the future scores was much better for the 120 milligrams compared to the 80 milligrams. So taken into consideration of the totality of evidence, it supported them to bring forward or recommend the phase 2 dose as 120 milligrams. So again, you can see that PROs are being utilized here to help make better decisions. Now, I've shown you 2 rare exemplar cases, but so they do exist. However, consistency does not. And there's still quality gaps that remain the norm, as you can see earlier from the previous reviews. And next, I'm going to touch on how the OPTIMISE program and really is there to help to fill that gap. And it's a practical way to help us better integrate and PROs in this setting. So OPTIMISE stands for Incorporating Patient-Reported Outcomes in Dose-Finding Oncology Trials. So a quick overview. So OPTIMISE program really provides that structured, consensus-driven guidance for meaningful PRO use in this setting. So for the OPTIMISE research objective recommendations, the one that published in JCO is really to ask what is the purpose of us including PROs and what are we measuring? And then moving from that, building on that PRO objectives, is just thinking about how to then analyze and present it, and that's been covered by OPTIMISE analysis recommendations. So for OPTIMISE research objective recommendations, it's very much a consensus-driven methodological grounded framework. We first did a methodological review of what the potential items that should be considered in this setting, what the potential PRO objectives. To generate a list of the objectives, it then went through a 2-round Delphi survey that included over 100 people to actually rate how important those objectives are. And then it ended with a consensus meeting, having recommendations at the end. The targeted stakeholder groups for the Delphi survey included both from the non-commercial as well as commercial organizations of different job roles including clinicians, trial management staff, statisticians, pro-methodologists, funders, and so on. So we also have regulators and journal editors and even patient partners being included in that in this Delphi survey. So on the right, you can see the different Delphi rounds, how many items went through each of the round. The additional items were also introduced going into the second round. At the end, we had 12 items that compiled into 6 recommendations. And I'll go through some of the recommendations now. So the first recommendation is about what the 3 core pro concepts of tolerability that we should be considering in this setting. The first one is overall site impact or burden, overall health-related quality of life, and lastly, symptomatic adverse events for those core concepts that we should be capturing. So just give you an example of what an overall side effect impact is. So one of the pro tools that you could use to capture that is the FACT-GP5. So there are others as well. So in this example here, from FACT-GP5, patients will be asked to rate this question. I'm bothered by side effects of treatment. They could score from not at all the way to very much, and that relates to the past 7 days. So this question captures overall side effect burden, but not individual symptoms. Now the next question here is about individual symptoms, and this example is about abdominal pain. So it's from PRO-CTCA, so it's another pro instrument, and it's actually really kind of mirrors what the CTCA grading is. So patients self-report symptom experience rating frequency, severity, and interference. So you can be asked in the last 7 days, how often do you have pain to the abdomen? And whether never, rarely, occasionally, frequently, or almost constantly. And then subsequent questions on severity as well as interference. Now, if you compare that to the CTCA grading, which is slightly different, so it's only grade from grade 1 to 3, and there's no sub-questions on interference or interference or harm. So what this example is trying to show is that PRO-CTCA complements CTCA by providing richer insights into patients' lived experience. And one of the key things is that it's systematic. So you're asking, when you compile your pro questionnaires, the patients are asked to answer each of those questions. So the second recommendations is and it's about assessing tolerability across the whole dose finding pathways. So that's across escalation, expansion, or optimization. Thirdly, it's about defining pro endpoints by specifying the assessment time period of interest and really looking at each dose level. Fourthly, it's about guiding next phase pro endpoints. So utilizing the pros in your early phase trials to really inform how to best and define your endpoints in the subsequent trials. So including pros in your final dose selection. And lastly, is to be very clear about whether your pro objectives is descriptive, exploratory, or it could be statistically powered so that it can guide the appropriate analysis. So the key message is clarity, is being explicit about what the pros are intended to inform and when. So building on the optimized research objective recommendations is optimized analysis recommendations. And the key message here is that rigorous pro-analysis is feasible even with small numbers. So here we reviewed the literature on what the key pro-analytical approaches has been implemented in practice. We also looked at pro-analytical strategies in the later phase trials and how they can be adapted and refined for the dose-finding oncology setting. So I'm going to look through some of the examples in this published paper. So it's, for example, first example is about looking at ordinal pro scores over time by dose. Here we're looking at the PRO-CTCA severity score at each time point for 3 dose levels at 10 patients per dose. Now the unreported is by the patients with no PRO-CTCA at that particular time point. So what this figure shows is the pro-symptomatic adverse events across time, and it's color-coded with traffic color system and with descriptive labels. So green means that there's none of those of the symptoms, and mild, and going on to very severe in red. With a quick glance, you can see that for dose 1 is tolerable and seems to be quite stable across time. For dose 2 and 3, tolerability got worse, and actually it gets worse a bit over time as well. Now, the methodological strengths of such a figure is that it's transparent display of missing data as well. So you've got unreported and intercurrent events that will obviously impact on interpretation. So there is a transparent display of that. It's consistent with pro reporting standards for the later phase trials as well, and it supports early phase needs. This is transparent, interpretable, and is really supporting decisions. The next example is looking at continuous PRO scores. So PROs could be continuous as well, particularly looking at, for example, quality of life. And here, this example is looking at between 2 time points. So what the figure shows 3 different PRO domains. So that's global health status, physical functioning, and role functioning. It displays the mean change from baseline to time point 7 with a confidence interval. And actually has also sees the bands. So the green bands is at least 10 points is improvement, and worsening is the minus 10 points and below. So the methodological strength of such a figure is that it shows that having that confidence interval show the precision of the mean change. It shows a clear as a display of meaningful thresholds, and that should be decided upfront. And so the missing data is included. And on the right, you can see a table, so you can actually display that as a table instead of the figure. So depending on your preference, again, this is really intended to be very transparent and interpretable and really helping to support decision. Lastly, there is also quite a big section on statistical modeling approaches that could be considered in this setting for those oncology trials. And we also look at the distinct strengths and limitations. So this is just an example here on the generalized linear models. When is it suitable? What is its strengths? What is its limitations? And we also listed out where they have been used, so exemplar use in some of the published literature that we have. So in this example for GLMs, it's suitable for 2-point comparisons, but it's not appropriate for repeated measures data. So I think the key message is that there's a need for analytical rigor even in relatively small early phase trials. So now let's look at what we think is the future for PROs in this setting. I think it's about purposeful PRO integration. As we've seen in the trend, we think that the trend, the increase and PRO integration in early phase trials in terms of the collection of it will continue to increase. However, it's important that it's not just a tick box exercise. It needs to be there for a decision relevant. So it really needs to be there to help to make better decisions for us. And the second bit is about formal integration of PROs, and really whether there will be more of future trials that really really incorporated PROs and actually having a formal decision framework that helps to decide where the PROs comes in, whether it actually informs the interim decisions or whether it's only being incorporated right at the end of the final decision. So here we list some of the PRO integrated trial designs. So the very first design was PRO CRM by Shinkley from Columbia. And here these are endpoints that they looked at. So for PRO CRM, the endpoints that's being assessed is clinician DLT, so binary patient DLT. So binary, the PRO used in the decisions are both the interim and the final. So Emily in her PhD then extended it to utility PRO CRM, is really working together with Shink, adding in a utility trade-off for patient and clinician DLTs, again utilizing it at the interim and the final. So there are other designs for PRO-ISO as well as type PRO CRM taking into account kind of delayed endpoints too. And there's some two recent designs for PRO-ADD as well as Windows, which I'll cover later very briefly. But one of the things to highlight is that the PRO use is only being done right at the end. So at the end of the dose optimization part to select the best dose utilizing PROs and other endpoints. So for PRO-ADD, we utilize preliminary efficacy. We looked at continuous PRO-AEs and beyond cycle 1, and we use a loss function optimization to do the trade-off. For Windows, it's a hierarchical multi-outcome win ratio-based approach, including PROs. I'll talk a bit more later. So early designs has actually utilized PROs as binary toxicity signals during escalation, but some of the recent designs that we've developed has really thought a bit more about utilizing PROs right at the end. And that's really through feedback from stakeholders that, and putting that right at interim might not be something that they're so comfortable with, at least at this time. And actually thinking about utilizing PROs together with all the other endpoints to make decisions is something that they're very interested in. And that's really helped guide us into really thinking about designs that can incorporate PROs at the end of the trial. So, and I think the next key step is there are going to be more trial designs that integrate PROs formally. But I think one key thing is about actually real trial implementation that's implemented into real trials and really seeing how that actually helps the trial to make better decisions. So now first I'm going to touch on U-PRO CRM, so this utility pro CRM. As I mentioned, this book done by Emily, the PhD, that was published not too long ago in ESMO opened. So let's start off with and the CRM. So we have here, we're looking at MTD dose selection. So the CRM is a model-based design, and probably most of you will be very familiar with it. It's really modeling dose and DLT's relationship, assuming that as you increase in dose level, you increase the risk of DLTs. So in a CRM, you only have we have a target DLT rate. So let's say this is 25%. So we then select the dose that's closest to that target. So in this green region, all doses within the green region are then considered acceptable. Now in PRO-CRM, Xing Li et al. In the Stats in Medicine paper here then introduced this design whereby they not only considered the clinician DLT, but they also considered a patient DLT. So let's say the patient DLT here is at 35%. You can see that the green region now, the acceptable doses are then reduced, taking into account the PROs. So in fact, there's actually a trial that's implemented PRO-CRM by Wages et al. So next, we then look at actually a utility pro CRM. That's actually adding in a utility curve there to find the best dose, taking into account both patient and clinician DLT. Now, for the patient DLT probability, you can see from here that so if, for example, we're targeting the clinicians, that's in orange. So we're trying to find the dose that is actually closest to that target. And then for the blue target, that's for patient DLT, and we're trying to find the dose that's close to the patient and DLT rate as well. And then the final dose is the minimum of those two, DC and DP. Now, utility pro CRM is then really looking at the dose of estimated clinician DLT and patient DLT that's closest to this utility. And this utility can be defined. It could look like this, or it could look like that. And it's really trying to think about what's a suitable utility curve, what's a suitable trade-off, and then you're trying to find the dose that is closest to that utility curve. So giving an illustrative example, so you have 39 patients here enrolled in cohorts of 3. You have two utility curves, so alpha equals to 2 gives you that rate curve, and alpha equals to 15 gives you that dark blue curve. And here we're looking at true DLT and clinician DLT rates as stated here, as well as a true patient DLT rate as stated there. Now, if you have a hypothetical trial that's been conducted starting at dose level 1, you can see cohorts of 3 patients. The ones that are highlighted in yellow are the ones whereby there's DLT. So whether P is for patient DLT, B is for both patient and clinician DLT, and C stands for clinician DLT. Now, the pathways are the same across regardless of which utility curve you choose, but right up to patient 27. For patient 28, actually the paths diverge. So it depends on whether you have chosen alpha equals to 15 or alpha equals 2. You end up treating subsequent patients at higher dose levels if you've chosen alpha equals to 15. And if you've chosen alpha equals to 2, you'll put the patients at lower dose level, dose level 3. And this is because of the estimated dose level, and you can see from here, the X here, that of where it is. And dose level 4 is the closest to the utility curve with alpha equals to 15. Now, next, I'm going to touch on PRO-ADD, which is the patient-reported outcomes-aided dose optimization design. Again, this is spearheaded by Emily in her PhD. It's really looking at patient-empowered dose-finding trials, integrating safety, preliminary efficacy, and patient-reported outcomes for optimal dose selection. First, PRO-ADD is really about not just a design, or rather it's more about a modular conceptual framework. Really thinking about, we are going through often dose escalation component before moving to dose optimization and then having that final dose recommendation. So for the dose escalation part, you can have a dose escalation trial designed and what are the endpoints that help you to decide whether you would escalate or de-escalate, and when do you want to do the interim analysis, whether is it after every 3 patients, 4 patients, and what are the endpoints that is actually going to be involved in the interim analysis. And once you know which doses you're interested in, then you move on towards the dose optimization phase. So that could be a randomization strategy to randomize across admissible doses. And here again, you're looking at what are the endpoints that help to inform that dose optimization phase and what the interim analysis that'll be involved here. And once you complete the dose stage 1 and stage 2, then it's a final dose recommendation. What's the decision criterion that you're going to use? It's going to be example loss function, utility function, and example trade-off framework. And what the endpoints that's going to be utilized to help to make the decisions of what's the optimal dose and what's the estimation strategy for those endpoints. So this is an illustrative example of what a PRO-ADD design could be, utilizing the modular framework that I've taught to you earlier on. So for example, the dose escalation trial design, we can adopt BOIND, but we could easily adopt continuous assessment method as well. For the dose escalation decision, we might want to consider DLTs, so dose limiting toxicities, but we can have at various interim, we could be stopping the dose, the trial completely if all dose levels are unsafe. So having that pre-specified how you're going to look at the interim analysis on what the stopping rules. Now, once you select, once you identify the doses that are clinically safe, then it's going to the dose optimization part. So the randomization strategy here could be inversely randomizing patients inversely proportional to the number of patients per dose. And you can think about a different strategy suited to your trial. And the endpoint here could be dose limiting toxicity as well as binary response with interim analysis, stopping early if the doses are too toxic. And for fertility, it's about stopping early if any of the dose levels are clearly futile. And for the final dose selection, we've adopted, in this example, a L2 loss function, but another function could be actually considered as well. And this is really about thinking about the trade-off between response and pro-tolerability data among the clinically safe and doses. And the endpoints here, we're looking at patient-reported outcomes as well as the binary response and the estimation for the patient-reported outcomes utilizing a generalized linear mixed effects model, and for the binary response using IPART. I'll talk a bit more about it later. Okay, let's focus first on the patient-reported outcomes. So we have, in the example, for example, if a trial, you collected multiple PRO-AE items. How do we calculate a burden score for these multiple items? And should it be continuous and should it reflect changes beyond cycle 1? And then after we've got that and AE scores, how do we model that across time and predict scores at specific points? And this could be utilized, for example, using a Bayesian mixed effects beta regression model. So we'll briefly run through this. So this is a normalized PRO-AE burden score. It is really borrowing ideas from what's been proposed also in the clinician reported using CTCAE. And a lot of those being reported burden scores could actually be adapted in the PRO setting as well. So this is the formulas for the normalized PRO-ADD score burden score, but if you want to, you can look at this example, which might be easier. So say, for example, we're asking patients to rate 3 adverse events, ranging from none to very severe. So if they score mild, we give them 1 point. They score moderate, we give them 2 points, severe 3 points, and very severe 4 points. And you can actually weight those scores as well. But let's say make it very simple. So in this example, this patient rated moderate, so that's 2 points, severe 3 points, and moderate 2 points. So 2 plus 3 plus 2. And then you normalized it because it's a maximum of 12 points that you could get. That's a PRO-ADD burden score of 0.58. So there's a very intuitive interpretation of this. So the PRO normalized AE scores actually ranges from 0 to 1. If they do not have any PRO-AE scores at all, then actually the score is 0. If they're all scoring as moderate, then your normalized scores is 0.5. So, and going very briefly into the estimation for the binary response, you can use a beta binomial, but we decided to use the IPART because we found that actually that's much better in actually modeling the response across doses. So this is an inverse product of independent probability escalation to estimate the probability of response for each dose. Now, what are the differences? So in this paper, we also compared between U-BOIND and PRO-ADD. So the common features of U-BOIND and PRO-ADD, so they're both two-stage designs. So there is an escalation component to identify the maximum tolerated dose with DLTs, and then the optimized dose using a trade-off framework. The key differences between those two designs is obviously that PRO-ADD utilizes PROs to help make the final decision, while U-BOIND and does not. So in terms of dose escalation, during the optimization, PRO-ADD looked at admissible doses that's defined by DLT-based safety and actually those that are not futile. U-BOIND is utility-driven allocations across that, so they're based on both response and DLT. At the final analysis, what defines the optimal dose? PRO-ADD utilizes response and patient-reported tolerability burden among all the DLT-based safe doses, U-Point looks at response and DLTs for them. So there's no tolerability modeling at U-Point, but PRO-ADD actually explicitly modeled it. So here's a snapshot of the simulation results. In the first scenario, you can see that the burden score increases across dose levels. The probability of efficacy increases, but dose 4 and dose 5 are fairly similar at 42% and 44%. Both designs does very well at around the same, very similar performance. But let's look at scenario 2, whereby again, PRO-AE burden score increases across dose levels, but there's a plateau of the efficacy. From dose 3 to dose 5, the efficacy is similar at 42%. And this is actually something that we expect to see in some of the more modern agents like immunotherapies and targeted agents. PRO-ADD actually performs much better than U-Point by taking into consideration the PRO-AE burden score. So to summarize, PRO-ADD performs well in identifying optimal dose, selecting the most tolerable effective dose while avoiding higher safe doses with no added efficacy benefit. Okay, lastly, just to touch on about the WIN dose, which is a hierarchical multi-outcome dose selection. So this has just been published just about a week ago. It's really very much simple dose optimization framework that combines multiple outcomes hierarchically to identify the dose with the strongest overall benefit risk. So the outcomes are prioritized upfront. The doses are then compared using hierarchical generalized pairwise comparisons metric. So for example, we have utilized win ratio here. So doses are compared sequentially between 2, and there actually could be more doses as well using those pre-specified priorities. For example, it could be asking first whether the dose is safe. So that's looking at DLTs, whether it's active, looking at treatment response, and then looking at tolerability, whether it's tolerable. And that's looking at treatment modification, discontinuations of patient-reported therapeutic measures. And the dose that wins most and pairwise comparisons is then the preferred dose. So Windows makes the dose selection priorities explicit, structured, and transparent, formally embedding the patient voice. So key takeaways. It's important for us if we want to utilize PROs, that's purposeful use of it. So to enable that, we need to really define what the clear PRO objectives. So be explicit about what PROs inform and when, because that's important, as that drives the trial design, the endpoints, the analysis, as well as the interpretation. Use PROs to complement the clinical endpoints, because they can actually capture patient burden that's beyond CTCAE as well as dose-limiting toxicities. Integrate PROs early and longitudinally, so embedding it across the dose-finding pathways, escalation, expansion, and optimization. PRO integration spans 2 key approaches. I've touched on both. So it can actually be using to inform dose selection descriptively to support interpretation, or can be formally integrated within the trial design, whether that be interim or whether that be interim and final or only at the final. So that's through explicit integration within the statistical trial design. So I've introduced to you the OPTIMISE framework. It's really very much practical framework to help us to define clearer objectives and leading on to rigorous analytical strategies. So from PRO, patient-reported experience to better dose decision. What needs to change in early phase trials? We need to move beyond defining what is safe to actually defining also explicitly what is tolerable for the patients. We need to design PROs to capture the patient voice for tolerability assessment and dose selection. We need to analyze and also publish PRO findings transparently. I need to emphasize publish because not a lot of trials actually have not published their PRO findings. And I think that's really lead to research waste. It's so important to publish that alongside our clinical endpoints and not as optional add-ons. So PROs have been undervalued for too long, and better PRO integration can lead to better dose decisions. So my ending is a last quote. In early phase trials, the goal is not just to find a dose that patients can survive, but a dose that they can live with. And this needs a collaborative effort to work with patients, clinicians, statisticians, PRO methodologists, really thinking about how best we can really integrate PROs early in the development pathway. So huge thanks to all my funders, as well as and heartfelt thanks to all the collaborators in the last 6 years, in fact, of my PRO journey, and all the participants and many who have inspired and supported this journey. So this is the list of the over 60 people who have been involved in the publications that I mentioned in this talk, and especially wanted to mention Emily, Julia, Madeline, and Mel that have really been a very significant influence and contributed a lot to this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, this is a very comprehensive framework, pointing on pretty much all the steps in early development. Congratulations on coming up with such a framework. Any questions from the audience? Haven't seen any question in the chat box, but if you would like to unmute yourself, please do so. If you have any questions.
Yes, I'm very
Yes,
happy.
share the slides. So I have a question, Christina. You did mention upfront there is sort of various barriers in PRO use in early trials, and one of it mentioned as patient burden and staff burden, right? It reminded me of one of the conversations we discussed with the team pushing the PRO into the early trials. Some pushback was usually in early oncology, those patients are in the very severe situation, sort of struggling a lot of pressures, not only from the side effects, but also from a lot of processes goes to hospital and struggling from the support from the family, et cetera, et cetera. And pushback mainly focus or concern about the prolonged questionnaires in the PRO and sort of time consuming and energy consuming for those very weak patients. So any considerations of sort of streamline either the questionnaires, the questions or processes and all that, or sort of support the patients in either easy completion of those trial and those PRO questions, etc. along those.
Yeah, no, excellent question. A very practical one. Yes, I think that is definitely one of the key concern about particularly for this patient group. As you mentioned, they are a lot weaker and sicker than compared to like the later phase patients. One key thing is that and obviously there's been quite a lot of work into integrating e-PRO, so electronic PROs, because that would really help in making it easier. These patients regularly do come into the clinic almost weekly, and while they're waiting, anesthesia has shown that actually they're very willing to complete it. In fact, the Princess Margaret Cancer Center, the study that I shown about that butterfly plot, they asked all 78 symptomatic adverse events of the PRO-CTSU to the complete set. I think that that could be streamlined, so we don't have to ask all 78, but even with that 78 symptoms being asked, there was high completion rate for across I think a few hundred patients that they asked. So I think it's feasible, definitely. They've shown that there, but obviously it'll be quite good to get more evidence of that. But I think that, and there's been quite a bit of ongoing work to think about what the key relevant questions. I think if the questions are relevant, patients will be very happy to actually answer those questions. And thinking about like practically when would they do it? Like, perhaps during the clinic visits might be a good reminder, because I guess people can provide some support as well. Paper prose has been shown to be feasible as well, but I think it's challenging when you have a lot of questions. So I would think that e-prose is probably a useful one to actually have it. Particularly, I guess, in terms of strategy-wise, you might want to ask more questions at the early stage and then stream it down in the later phase, because you then know what the exact symptoms or what the aspects that you want to monitor. And then you might actually kind of like maybe making it less regular for the later phase. So you might start more in the early phase and then actually trim it down later on. So yeah, so actually thinking about the practical bits would be quite very key.
Thank you. There's a question from the audience saying, how do you translate hazard ratio, quality of life, or PRO to a minimum clinical important difference?
Yeah, so there's been so in terms of the clinical important difference, that's been really very much from the late phase setting. So they've shown what are the different domains, whether that's and for the ERTC, it's actually been well validated, and that specs is between 5 to 10. So the example that showed has utilized 5. I guess the question is that, is this definitely applicable to the early phase setting as well? Because those are obviously done much in the later phase setting. That's a question. I think there's probably more research needs to be done in that space. And yeah, I think if I've not answered your question, please let me know.
No. Okay, so the next question is, how would you propose to evaluate cumulative tolerability since most newer oncology meds are intended for long-term use and have
Uh,
better patient outcomes?
Yeah, great question. I think so I think if you're interested in looking at the more like the cumulative aspects of it, so like this the normalized PRO-ADD scores that I mentioned, whereby you can have a score and look at it over time and actually kind of having that can look at the area under the curve or some sort will be useful because I think pros are the one because you're systematically collecting it over time, you could actually be modeling that to see whether there's been a cumulative effect.
Mhm. If you want to unmute yourself for a follow-up question, please feel free to do so. If not, just move on to the next question. How do you consider the discrepancy between clinical and pro report result? How to incorporate them into the hierarchical model?
That's a great question. I think it's not surprising that the clinicians and the patient reports are different because the way that they are collected is different as well. I think that if you want to, depending on what your objective is, I think you should definitely take both of them into account. So, for example, you want to model, let's say, for example, you want to model the association between certain clinician patient report clinician kind of measures as well as patient measures, and look at the association with treatment discontinuation. I think you need to adjust for both, right? So you need to put that into both in the model to see whether these contribute additional value above one and the other. So yeah, so I think they're looking at slightly different things. So clinicians typically report. So they're I think in general, we would say that I mean we've seen that already, and they might not report a lot of the more kind of like moderate AEs, so they're probably reported worse. But actually, the severe AEs are well reported, and because that's very much the safety component of it. While patients report anything that affects them, and you get and one nice things about it is that they are their own controls, right? So you get them at baseline, you get how they got worsened or improved over time as well, and they're the same person that's measuring it. But for clinician reported, one thing that people might not recognize is that different clinicians might be rating the same patient at different times.
So, Gordon, you have a follow-up question about the wider confidence interval? You want to unmute yourself, or do you mean wider confidence interval?
Oh, excuse me. So I think that it is with the description with maybe different clinician or different with the clinician with the patient report the result. I think maybe we have a wider the dose DLT ratio and the endpoint the credibility, and so we can have so I think that it is the most reason I ask the question is that do we want to make more weight on the clinical results more than the the patient based? So I think that is because the clinician is more a specialist, right? So should we weight more in the clinician and their opinion?
I think the clinician's opinion is very critical, particularly for the safety component aspects of it, trying to assess safety. I think for tolerability, you need to take into account both what the clinician reports as well as what patients reports. Like like if you remember the diagram that I showed about kind of like what the key components that kind of contribute to the tolerability assessment. I think both clinicians as well as patients aspects of it I mean, they do contribute. I don't think one is better than the other, but I think they are all important. It's about complementing, and actually totality of that actually helps us to better inform whether a dose is actually tolerable.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We have 2 minutes. Perhaps the last question. Have you looked into incorporating drug concentrations such as PK beta into your tolerability assessment?
A great question, Richard. I think that's definitely can be considered in our Windows paper. We haven't actually included that, but yes, that could be one of the outcomes that you could be thinking about as well, and that can be included in that framework.
Okay, great. Any other questions? If not, well, thank our speaker today. Thank you so much for bringing such a comprehensive framework to us. And we will share the slides and recording after the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.